March 17, 1944. Camp, Aliceville, Alabama. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber stood in the recreation hall of the prisoner of war compound, his posture military straight despite 6 months of captivity. Behind him, 19 other German musicians, former members of Wehrmacht regimental bands, Berlin conservatory students, small-town church organists, waited with the disciplined patience that defined everything they'd been taught about culture, order, and the proper relationship between music and society. They had agreed to this meeting with American cultural officers because refusal seemed pointless. The war was already lost, though few admitted it aloud. Major Robert Chen, a Chinese-American officer from San Francisco's music education program, adjusted the needle on a phonograph player. "Gentlemen," he said in careful German, "what you're about to hear is called bebop. It was recorded 3 months ago in New York City. The musicians are Charlie Parker on alto saxophone and Dizzy Gillespie on trumpet." Weber exchanged glances with Lieutenant Hans Kruger, a former music professor from Heidelberg. They had been warned about jazz, the entartet music, degenerate music born of racial mixing and moral decay. But nothing in their training, nothing in their ideology, nothing in their entire understanding of what music could be, prepared them for what happened when Chen lowered the needle onto the spinning vinyl disc. The sound that emerged from the speakers seemed to violate every principle of musical composition that Weber had spent 20 years mastering. The alto saxophone entered with a phrase that defied melodic logic, angular, fragmented, seemingly random notes that somehow cohered into a statement of ferocious intelligence. Then the trumpet answered, not with harmony, but with argument, extending and contradicting the saxophone's line simultaneously. Weber's first reaction was revulsion. This wasn't music. It was acoustic chaos, the sonic equivalent of modern art's deliberate ugliness. The rhythm section played patterns that seemed designed to disorient rather than support. There was no clear melody to follow, no satisfying resolution, no sense that the composer had provided a stable framework for the performers to execute. But then something shifted in his perception. Approximately 40 seconds into the recording, Weber's trained ear began detecting something beneath the surface chaos. Structure, but structure of a radically different kind. The musicians weren't simply improvising randomly. They were constructing elaborate melodic lines in real time, referencing and transforming a harmonic progression he could now barely discern beneath their innovations. Kruger leaned forward, his face transformed from disgust to intense concentration. As a musicologist, he had studied African polyrhythms as primitive precursors to European rhythmic sophistication. But what he was hearing now wasn't primitive. It was vastly more complex than anything Wagner or Strauss had attempted. Multiple rhythmic layers interweaving, each musician maintaining independent time while contributing to collective momentum. "It's like listening to 4 simultaneous conversations," Kruger whispered, "where each person is saying something different, but somehow they're all discussing the same profound subject." The other prisoners showed varying reactions. Some turned away in genuine distress. Their worldview couldn't accommodate what they were hearing. Others listened with visible confusion, trying to force this music into categories that would make sense within their training. But a core group of about 8, including Weber and Kruger, experienced something closer to vertigo. The sensation of standing on solid ground only to discover the ground itself was moving. When the recording ended, barely 3 minutes total, silence filled the room. Major Chen watched them carefully, saying nothing, letting them process. He had seen this reaction before with other prisoner groups. The music did something that lectures about democracy could never accomplish. It provided direct, undeniable evidence that everything they'd been taught about racial and cultural superiority was demonstrably false. Weber finally spoke. "Play it again," he said quietly. "I need to understand what I just heard." Major Chen obliged, playing the recording 3 more times in succession. With each repetition, Weber heard new layers of sophistication. The piece, which Chen identified as Coco, recorded in November 1945, was built on the chord changes of Cherokee, a popular swing tune. But Parker and Gillespie had transformed those changes into a launching pad for harmonic exploration that made German chromatic theory seem elementary. "How can they do this?" Weber asked, his German formality cracking. "The speed of the melodic invention, the harmonic substitutions, this requires years of theoretical training." But we were told these musicians were untrained, instinctive, primitive. Chen smiled without satisfaction. He'd heard variations of this question many times. Charlie Parker, he said, practices 12 hours daily. He has memorized the harmonic structure of hundreds of songs. He can transpose any melody into any key instantly. Dizzy Gillespie studied trumpet technique with classical teachers and developed an embouchure that lets him play higher notes with greater precision than most symphony players. These men are not instinctive or primitive. They are masters who chose a different path toward mastery. Kruger was making notes furiously in a small journal he'd been allowed to keep. But the composition itself, who wrote this? Where is the score? There is no score, Chen replied. The composition is happening in real time. They agreed beforehand on the tempo, the key, and the underlying harmonic progression. Everything else, every melodic phrase, every rhythmic variation, is being created spontaneously as they play. The concept seemed impossible. In German musical education, composition and performance were separate disciplines. Great composers wrote music. Skilled performers executed it. The idea that performance could be composition, that the act of playing could be simultaneously the act of creating, contradicted the fundamental hierarchy of their musical culture. Then each performance is unique? Weber asked. This recording captured something that will never exist again in exactly this form? Correct, Chen confirmed. That's the nature of jazz improvisation. It's not about perfecting a fixed interpretation. It's about being fully present in the moment of creation, responding to your fellow musicians, taking risks, sometimes failing, but always pushing forward. Weber looked at his fellow prisoners. Several appeared deeply troubled. This wasn't just different music. It was a different epistemology, a different understanding of what creativity meant and where authority resided in artistic practice. I would like to learn this, Weber said suddenly. Not to play it. I know my limitations, but to understand it. Will you teach us? Major Chen arranged for Sergeant Marcus Hill to conduct weekly seminars with the interested prisoners. Hill, a bassist from the Chicago jazz scene who'd been drafted in 1942, approached the assignment with skepticism. Most of these boys spent years being taught I'm subhuman, he told Chen privately. Now they want to learn my music? Feels like cultural tourism. Maybe, Chen acknowledged. Or maybe it's the beginning of genuine transformation. Either way, it's worth attempting. The first session began with Hill playing a simple 12-bar blues on his upright bass. Just the fundamental progression, no embellishment. This, he explained through Chen's translation, is the foundational structure of most jazz and blues. 12 bars, 3 chords, a specific harmonic rhythm. Your job isn't to play this pattern perfectly. Your job is to understand it so deeply that you can play with it, against it, around it, to make it your own. Weber and his group struggled immediately. They could execute the pattern flawlessly after one demonstration. Their technical training made that trivial. But when Hill asked them to add their own voice to the progression, they froze. What did that even mean? Music was written by composers. Performers performed what was written. The space between score and execution was where error occurred, not where creativity happened. Hill picked up his bass and demonstrated. He played the basic blues progression, then repeated it with slight variations, bending notes, adding chromatic passing tones, shifting rhythmic emphasis. The third time through, he sang while playing, his voice rough and unpolished by conservatory standards but carrying emotional weight that made Weber's throat tighten inexplicably. That's not written anywhere, Hill explained. That came from how I was feeling in this moment, in this room, playing for you. Tomorrow it would be different. That's the freedom and the responsibility of jazz. You can't hide behind the composer's authority. You have to stand naked in your own voice. The metaphor was uncomfortable and precise. Everything about German military culture was about hiding individual vulnerability behind collective identity, behind rank, behind ideology. This music demanded the opposite, radical individual authenticity within a collective form. Kruger raised his hand tentatively. What if our voice is inadequate? What if what we have to express isn't worthy of expression? Hill's answer was immediate. Then you're human. Welcome to the human race. Now pick up your instrument and try anyway. The weekly sessions created unexpected turmoil within the prisoner population. Weber's group began practicing in the evenings, attempting simple jazz exercises Hill had assigned. The sounds, tentative, often discordant, clearly amateur, drifted across the compound and provoked strong reactions. Hauptmann Otto Brandt, a committed National Socialist and former Gestapo liaison officer, confronted Weber in the mess hall. "You're embracing nigger music," he said loudly enough for surrounding prisoners to hear. "You're betraying every principle we fought for. German culture is the highest human achievement. This jazz is the sound of racial degeneration." Weber met his gaze steadily. "I'm learning American music from American teachers. If that troubles you, file a complaint with the commandant." But Brandt's challenge resonated with Weber's own doubts. Late at night, he wrote in a hidden journal, "Am I being weak? We lost the war militarily. That's merely the fortune of arms. But are we now losing culturally, accepting our captors' values, abandoning our identity? Or is what I'm learning actually true in some way that transcends politics and nationality?" The crisis deepened when Hill introduced the group to the concept of call and response, a fundamental jazz principle where musicians engage in musical dialogue, one voice calling out a phrase and another answering. Hill demonstrated by playing a bass line and having Chen answer on clarinet. "This comes from African musical traditions," Hill explained. "It's about community, about conversation, about equals communicating through sound. It's the opposite of the conductor-orchestra hierarchy, where one person's vision controls everyone else." Weber heard in this description something that went beyond music. German society had been structured around the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle where authority flowed downward from superior to inferior. Jazz suggested a horizontal structure where authority was distributed, where creativity emerged from dialogue rather than command. Kruger articulated what Weber was thinking. If music can work this way, if beauty can emerge from collective improvisation rather than singular vision, what does that suggest about other forms of social organization? The question hung in the air, dangerous and unavoidable. That night, Weber lay awake on his bunk, listening to the camp's night sounds. Somewhere across the compound, someone was humming a jazz melody, probably young Corporal Eisner, who'd taken to the music with disturbing enthusiasm. The sound was barely audible but unmistakable, and it carried implications that terrified Weber more than combat ever had. His worldview was improvising itself into something new, whether he consented or not. Weber received a letter from his wife Katharina that had taken 4 months to reach Alabama through Red Cross channels. Written in January 1944, it described Berlin under constant bombardment, food rationing becoming desperate, whispered rumors about the Eastern Front, and growing awareness that the war was irrevocably lost. But one paragraph struck Weber with particular force. "Your sister Margaret was denounced for listening to forbidden radio broadcasts, American music programs from Switzerland. The block warden reported her. She was questioned by the Gestapo for 8 hours. They released her with a warning, but Friedrich, she is 37 years old and they made her afraid of music. What kind of society have we created where melody becomes treason?" Weber shared the letter with Kruger during their next practice session. "My sister was interrogated for listening to the kind of music we're learning right now," he said quietly. "The regime I served, that we all served, considers this music dangerous enough to justify state violence. Why? Because it's aesthetically inferior? Or because it reveals something about freedom that authoritarian systems can't tolerate?" Kruger had been wrestling with similar questions. "I've been analyzing the structural principles of bebop," he said, pulling out his increasingly dense notebooks. "The music operates on multiple simultaneous levels of organization. There's the fixed structure, the chord changes, which provides collective coherence. But within that structure, each musician maintains complete individual freedom. They don't need a conductor because they're listening to each other with complete attention, adjusting in real time to maintain collective coherence while preserving individual voice. It's a musical model of functional democracy," Weber said, speaking the implication aloud for the first time. "Yes," Kruger agreed. "And we were taught democracy was chaos, that only strong hierarchical authority could create order. But this music proves that's false. This music is order, just a different kind of order, one that trusts individuals to self-coordinate through mutual attention, rather than requiring external authority to impose coordination by force." Major Chen, who had been listening from the doorway, added quietly, "Now you understand why your government banned it. The ban was never about aesthetic standards. It was about ideological threat. Jazz is proof that what you were taught about the necessity of authoritarian control was a lie." Weber nodded slowly. "And once you know something is a lie, you can't unknow it." You can only decide what to do with that knowledge. The question was, what would they do? Word of the jazz sessions spread beyond Camp Aliceville. Other POW camps, there were over 500 scattered across the American South and Midwest, began requesting similar cultural programs. The Army's Civil Affairs Division saw opportunity. If German prisoners could be genuinely re-educated through cultural exposure, it would dramatically ease post-war occupation challenges. But at Aliceville, something unexpected happened. Weber's group asked permission to perform a concert combining German classical music and American jazz, not separately but integrated. They wanted to perform Beethoven sonatas followed by jazz improvisations based on Beethoven's themes. They wanted to play traditional German folk songs arranged in swing style. They wanted to demonstrate that cultural boundaries were more permeable than ideology claimed. The camp commandant, Colonel William Foster, was intrigued but cautious. "You understand this will be controversial," he told Weber through an interpreter. "Among your fellow prisoners, among American audiences, among everyone. Are you prepared for that controversy?" "I'm a prisoner of war in Alabama learning jazz from a Negro sergeant," Weber replied. "My life is already controversial. At least let it be controversial in a way that means something." Sergeant Hill worked with the group intensively for 6 weeks. They chose pieces carefully. Bach's Prelude in C major, from the Well-Tempered Clavier, reimagined with jazz harmonies. Schubert's Die Forelle, The Trout, transformed into a medium-tempo swing number. And most audaciously, a collective improvisation based on Beethoven's Ode to Joy, taking Schiller's text about universal brotherhood and making it musically literal through jazz's collaborative creation. The rehearsals revealed both how far the musicians had come and how far they still needed to go. Their technical facility was undeniable. These were trained players with thousands of hours of practice. But jazz required something beyond technique. It required emotional transparency, willingness to take risks, comfort with imperfection, and trust in collaborative creation. "You're still playing like you're afraid of making mistakes," Hill told them repeatedly. "In jazz, mistakes aren't failures, they're opportunities. You hear something that doesn't work, you adjust, you incorporate it, you move forward. The music is alive, which means it's unpredictable. You've got to be comfortable with that uncertainty." Weber understood intellectually what Hill meant, but implementing it, allowing himself to play notes that might be wrong, trusting that the collective structure would support individual risk-taking, required unlearning decades of training that had taught him perfection was the only acceptable standard. The concert was scheduled for August 15, 1944. 3 weeks to learn not just new techniques but a new relationship to music itself. The makeshift auditorium held 400 people, 250 German prisoners, 100 American guards and officers, 50 civilian observers, including journalists and Red Cross officials. The cultural implications were obvious to everyone. German prisoners performing American music wasn't merely entertainment, but a statement about ideological transformation. Weber walked onto the stage with his clarinet, followed by 7 other prisoner musicians and 3 American players including Sergeant Hill. The mixed ensemble itself made a statement. Former enemies creating music together. Black and white musicians sharing a stage in the segregated South. The defeated learning from their captors. Hauptmann Brandt sat in the front row of the prisoner section, his face set in an expression of stony disapproval. Behind him, other Nazi loyalists radiated hostility. But scattered throughout the prisoner audience were men whose expressions showed curiosity, uncertainty, even anticipation. Weber announced the program in German, then in halting English. "We perform tonight music from 2 traditions, but we hope to show they are not opposite traditions. Both seek beauty, both require discipline, both express human soul. We are grateful to our American teachers for showing us this." They opened with Bach's Prelude in C major played straight, pristine, perfect, emotionally controlled in the German tradition. Then Hill counted off and they played it again, this time with swing rhythm, with bluesy harmonies, with small improvisational flourishes. The same notes, but transformed, not destroyed or degraded, but liberated, made conversational, made human. The prisoner audience reacted with sharp division. Some looked scandalized. This was desecration of sacred German culture. Others leaned forward with fascination. The Americans, by contrast, seemed uniformly delighted, several tapping their feet, one officer smiling broadly. Then came Schubert's Die Forelle, completely reimagined. The playful piano figure became a walking bass line. The vocal melody, sung by Eisner, whose voice had surprising jazz phrasing, swung like a Billie Holiday ballad. It was Schubert, but Schubert filtered through the African-American musical tradition, and the result was neither German nor American, but genuinely hybrid. When they reached the Ode to Joy improvisation, something magical occurred. The musicians had prepared a basic arrangement, but Hill had insisted they leave space for spontaneous creation. Weber played the famous melody, then each musician took turns adding their own variation, responding to what came before, building on each other's ideas, creating collective beauty through individual contributions. In that moment, ideology dissolved into music. They weren't German or American, victor or vanquished. They were musicians discovering what humans could create together when hierarchy yielded to collaboration. The applause was complicated, contested, but undeniable. Captain Eleanor Morrison, an Army intelligence officer assigned to monitor POW re-education programs, wrote a classified assessment of the Aliceville concert. Musical integration has accomplished in 8 weeks what traditional propaganda could not achieve in years. Demonstrable proof that racial theories are scientifically false. German musicians of acknowledged technical excellence have been forced to recognize that Negro American musicians possess not just equal, but often superior creative abilities. This recognition cannot be explained away by propaganda, because it derives from direct personal experience. Morrison's report continued. The ideological implications extend beyond racial attitudes. Jazz music operates on democratic principles, distributed authority, individual freedom within collective structures, bottom-up organization, value placed on innovation rather than tradition, success measured by adaptive creativity rather than perfect execution of predetermined plans. German prisoners learning jazz are inadvertently learning democratic social organization through aesthetic practice. The report recommended expanding the program to other camps, but it also noted risks. Approximately 35% of prisoners at Aliceville remain committed to National Socialist ideology and view the jazz program as cultural contamination. There have been threats against participating prisoners, particularly those who have embraced the program most enthusiastically. We are monitoring for potential violence. The threats were real. Weber received an unsigned note slipped under his door. Traitors face consequences. Today you betrayed German music. Tomorrow you will betray Germany. We remember. We will return home. So will you. Weber showed the note to Major Chen, who took it seriously. I can provide protection within the camp, Chen said, but I can't protect you from what happens after the war. You're making choices that will follow you home. I know, Weber replied, but I can't unknow what I've learned. Jazz has shown me that everything I believed about culture, race, and social organization was wrong. Not just politically wrong, factually wrong. The music works. Democracy and sound works. Individual freedom coordinated through mutual respect works. I've heard it. I've participated in it. I've helped create it. That experience can't be taken back. Kruger added, the question isn't whether we can continue believing Nazi ideology after this experience. We can't. The question is whether we'll have the courage to live according to what we now know is true, even when that courage is dangerous. Hill, who was present for the conversation, offered a jazz metaphor. You've played your note. Can't take it back. Now you've got to listen to how the other players respond and keep playing your truth anyway. That's what improvisation requires. Commitment even in uncertainty. Weber nodded. The concert had been a beginning, not an ending. The hard part was still ahead. German military intelligence operating from neutral Switzerland intercepted several letters from Aliceville prisoners to families in Germany. The content alarmed the Reichssicherheitshauptamt enough to issue a classified directive. American cultural re-education programs represent serious threat to ideological cohesion. Prisoners exposed to jazz music showing signs of democratic contamination. Upon repatriation, such individuals must be evaluated for political reliability before release to civilian life. But by November 1944, repatriation was theoretical. Germany was collapsing. Soviet armies had reached Poland. American forces were advancing through France. The Reich itself would likely cease to exist before prisoners returned home. Weber received a final letter from Katharina, dated September 1944, that had taken 2 months to arrive. Berlin is burning nightly. We hide in the U-Bahn tunnels during raids. Food is scarce. Heat is scarce. Hope is scarce. Your father says we are being punished for the regime's crimes. crimes we didn't fully understand until now. Soldiers returning from the East speak of terrible things, atrocities committed in our name. Friedrich, I don't know what you've experienced in America, but I hope it's been more humane than what we've inflicted. I hope you're learning something better than what we built here. The letter arrived the same week that camp authorities showed prisoners newsreel footage of Paris's liberation. The images of jubilant French crowds celebrating freedom provided stark contrast to reports of Germany's destruction. The war's moral dimensions were becoming undeniable. During that week's practice session, the mood was subdued. Weber finally spoke what everyone was thinking. We're learning this music while our homeland dies. While our families suffer consequences of a war we helped fight. How do we reconcile that? How do we hold both truths? That we were wrong, but we're still responsible? Hill offered no easy comfort. You don't reconcile it, he said bluntly. You carry it. You bear witness. You go home, if you go home, and you live differently because of what you learned. You teach what you learned. You raise children differently. You build something better from the ruins. Jazz teaches us that too, Kruger added quietly. How to take broken materials. The blues comes from slavery, from suffering, and transform them into beauty without denying the pain. Not transcending pain, but including pain, making pain part of the truth you express. That's all we can do now, Weber agreed. Learn this music. Learn what it teaches about freedom, about dignity, about human worth. Then carry that knowledge home to a country that desperately needs it. Major Chen arranged for a professional recording engineer from Birmingham to document the prisoner jazz ensemble's progress. The recordings would serve multiple purposes: evidence for the re-education program's effectiveness, historical documentation, and, most importantly, something the prisoners could carry home with them when the war ended. The session took place over 2 cold January days. The prisoners recorded 15 pieces, classical works, jazz standards, and their hybrid arrangements that blended traditions. Weber played clarinet on all tracks, his technique now incorporating elements of both classical precision and jazz flexibility, a synthesis that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The most powerful moment came during the final take of their Ode to Joy improvisation. Perhaps because they knew this was being preserved, perhaps because the war's end was imminent and they sensed their time together was finite, the musicians played with emotional transparency that overwhelmed the session's formality. Weber took a solo that began with Beethoven's melody played straight, then gradually transformed it, adding blue notes, bending pitches, introducing rhythmic complexity, while maintaining the theme's essential character. It was simultaneously Beethoven and not Beethoven, German and not German, classical and jazz, and something entirely new. When the take ended, the recording engineer, a middle-aged white Southerner who'd initially seemed skeptical of the entire project, removed his headphones slowly. "Gentlemen," he said, "I don't know if you realize what you just did, but that was something I've never heard before, and I've recorded a lot of music." Hill looked at Weber with an expression combining pride and sadness. "You found your voice," he said simply. "That's all jazz ever asks. Find your voice and tell your truth." The recording session concluded with an impromptu group performance not intended for preservation, just the musicians playing together one final time with no agenda, no audience, no purpose beyond the joy of collective creation. They played for 40 minutes, moving seamlessly from theme to theme, each musician contributing ideas, everyone listening intently, the music flowing like conversation among people who'd learned to understand each other beyond words. Afterward, as they packed instruments, Weber approached Hill with unusual formality. "Sergeant, I need to say something. 6 months ago, I believed you were racially inferior. That belief was central to my worldview. You have proven, not through argument but through your music, your teaching, your dignity, that everything I believed was contemptible nonsense. I apologize, and I thank you." Hill nodded slowly. "Apology accepted. Now go home and make sure other people learn what you learned. That's how you make amends." As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and began occupying German territory, the inevitable approached. The prisoners would go home to a country that no longer existed as they'd known it. Germany was being divided among occupiers. The Nazi regime was dissolving. Everything that had defined their identity as Germans was being fundamentally reorganized. The jazz musicians faced a particular challenge. They had learned something profoundly incompatible with the culture they were returning to. Not just skills, but values. not just techniques but ways of being. How would those lessons translate in a devastated, traumatized, occupied Germany? Weber organized a final meeting with his fellow musicians. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. "We're carrying something dangerous, the knowledge that freedom works, that democracy isn't chaos, that the racial theories we served were scientifically false. In the Germany we're returning to, that knowledge might not be welcome." Eisner, the youngest of the group, spoke up. "My family are committed party members. My father was an SA commander. When I return playing jazz, speaking about what I've learned here, they'll see it as betrayal. I might face worse than social disapproval." "We all might," Kruger acknowledged. "But what's the alternative? Pretend we didn't learn anything? Perform German music in the old way, as if these months never happened? That would be living a lie for the rest of our lives." "Jazz doesn't let you lie," Hill reminded them during their final practice session. "That's the thing about improvisation. Your truth comes through whether you want it to or not. You can play technically correct notes, but if you're not playing what you really feel, everyone hears it. That's why authoritarian societies hate this music. It's too honest." Weber made a decision. "We'll form an ensemble in Germany. After things settle, after occupation stabilizes, we'll find each other and we'll continue this work. We'll teach jazz to Germans who've never heard it. We'll demonstrate that cultural mixing creates beauty, not degradation. We'll be living proof that the ideology we fought for was wrong." "That's dangerous." Brandt's voice came from the doorway. He'd been listening. "You'll be marked as collaborators, as cultural traitors. The fact that Germany lost militarily doesn't mean Germans will accept cultural defeat. Many will see your jazz as further humiliation imposed by conquerors. Then they'll have to confront that," Weber said firmly. "Because I'm not unlearning what I learned. I'm not unhearing what I heard. This music changed me. I'm going home changed. That's just truth." Word spread through Camp Aliceville that Germany would surrender the following day. The European war was ending. Not with the glorious victory prisoners had once imagined, but with complete defeat, unconditional surrender, the dissolution of their nation as they'd known it. That evening, without official authorization, Weber and his ensemble gathered for one final performance. Prisoners crowded into the recreation hall. Not just the jazz enthusiasts, but everyone, including the Nazi loyalists who'd opposed the program from the beginning. Everyone wanted to mark this moment, to witness something that captured the complexity of what they were feeling. Weber stood before the crowd. "Tomorrow Germany surrenders," he said in German. "Everything we fought for ends. Some of you believe that means we've lost everything, but I want to suggest we've lost something that needed losing. And in losing it, we've gained the possibility of finding something better." He raised his clarinet. "This is an instrument created in Germany, perfected by German craftsmen, played in German orchestras for centuries. But tonight, I'm going to play it in a style created by enslaved Africans in America, developed by musicians we were taught to consider inferior. I'm going to do this not as betrayal of German culture, but as fulfillment of what German culture could have been, if it hadn't been poisoned by ideology." The ensemble began playing, a slow, mournful blues that captured everything: grief for the dead, shame for the crimes, fear of the uncertain future, but also hope, faint and fragile, that something better might be built from the ruins. Weber's solo was the most honest playing of his life. He didn't try to dazzle with technique. He simply told his truth through sound, the truth of a man who'd believed terrible things, fought for terrible things, witnessed those things collapse, and somehow found grace in the music of former enemies. The Nazi loyalists listened in stony silence, but others, maybe 40% of the prisoners, showed visible emotion. Some wept, some nodded in recognition, some looked like men emerging from long darkness into uncertain light. When the music ended, the silence was absolute. Then Kruger began applauding, slowly, deliberately. Others joined, not all but enough. It wasn't unanimous acceptance, wasn't collective transformation, but it was acknowledgement that something true had been expressed. The war ended not with triumph, but with a blues that contained possibility of redemption. Tomorrow they would begin learning how to live with what they'd learned. Friedrich Weber returned to Germany in September 1945, transported to Hamburg's ruins on an American Liberty ship crowded with repatriated prisoners. The city he'd left in 1942 no longer existed, 70% destroyed by firebombing, its harbor wrecked, its population traumatized and starving under British occupation. He found Katharina living in a partially collapsed apartment with their 2 children, surviving on British rations and black market trading. She barely recognized him. "You look different," she said. "Not just older. Different. I am different," he acknowledged. "I learned something in America, something about music, about freedom, about what humans can create when ideology doesn't constrain them." Within weeks, Weber located Kruger and Eisner. Both had survived the return. Both shared his determination to continue what they'd begun in Alabama. They found other musicians, some who'd been prisoners, some who'd simply survived the war. They began meeting in a cellar beneath a ruined church, practicing jazz in secret because they weren't sure how occupation authorities or German civilians would react. The first semi-public performance happened in January 1946 at a British officers' club. The British were intrigued by Germans playing American jazz. It suggested the re-education programs might actually be working. Word spread. Requests came for more performances. By 1947, Weber's ensemble was playing regularly in Hamburg's emerging club scene, part of a broader movement of Germans trying to rebuild culture without the poisonous nationalism that had destroyed their country. They played for German audiences who were initially suspicious, then curious, finally enthusiastic. They taught workshops on improvisation, on collective creation, on individual voice within communal structure. Weber never forgot Sergeant Marcus Hill's fundamental lesson: jazz doesn't let you lie. Every time he played, he was testifying to the truth he'd learned, that racial theories were false, that authoritarian systems stifled human creativity, that freedom wasn't chaos but a higher form of order requiring trust and mutual respect. In 1949, a young American journalist interviewed Weber for a story on German Reconstruction. "How did you survive the ideological transformation?" the journalist asked. "How did you move from Nazi soldier to jazz musician?" Weber considered carefully before answering. "I didn't survive it. The person I was died in Alabama, but something better was born. Music taught me that dying and being reborn isn't always tragedy. Sometimes it's the only path to truth." He raised his clarinet, and in the ruins of Hamburg, played freedom's sound.